The Chairperson of Parliament's Environment and Forestry Portfolio Committee, Phillip Modise, says mines remain Limpopo's biggest contributor to greenhouse emissions. Modise says that this was raised during the first public participation hearings on the new climate change bill in Sekhukhune. The bill seeks to create a new framework to deal with climate change and the just energy transition in South Africa. South Africa has seen heavy rains and floods in the last weeks, leading to severe damage to infrastructure as well as the loss of lives. To take this discussion further, we're joined via Zoom by Professor Patrick Bond. He's the Distinguished Professor for Sociology at the University of Johannesburg. A very good afternoon to you, Prof. Thank you for your time here on the SABC.
Thanks to be with you, Liesl. It's very, very sad after the report from Komani. This is the kind of experience that we all saw April 11, 12 in the KwaZulu-Natal area, in May 21. These are rain bombs, really, that are hitting ordinary people, and they're not being well defended.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, want us to look at the messaging of climate change to date in South Africa, the public perceptions around that, and really what's been done to date to mitigate against some of the challenges, because they're obviously short, medium, and long-term consequences. How would you say we're faring as a country at this point?
Well, very poorly. And one of the big debates is how do we stop our own emissions and how do we compensate the victims? And there's a loss and damage debate. Loss is the lost lives, more than a dozen in the last week all over the country, 7 provinces. And last April 11, there were more than 500 dead and still missing. So that's irreplaceable and priceless. But then there's the damage that's done through infrastructure destruction. And that's where I hope the finance minister, Enoch Godongwana, becomes much more aggressive when it comes to his responsibilities to free up money. And then there's adaptation. It's getting the stormwater drainage and some of the other critical factors. If you're a rural person needing irrigation because of the droughts, you've got drier soil, that could be one of the adaptation responses. And there's a final category of the climate finance, which is what we just got, $8.5 billion in loans for leaving our coal underground. In other words, not extracting fossil fuels. So those are the combinations of getting money to leave fossil fuels and pay for a just transition, money for the adaptation, to build the stormwater drainage and the irrigation, all the other things, making our roads and bridges stronger. And finally, the compensation for the loss and damage.
Prof, this obviously brings to the fore the importance of ESG. And in the context of South Africa's mining industry, just on the back of what transpired today, perhaps you can unpack, help us to understand, given the geopolitical risks transpiring the world over, perhaps also why it's so important to the industry. Perhaps you could talk to us how the industry could in fact navigate the ESG agenda and really what's then said to be the critical focus at this point.
Well, it's the mining and the smelting. That's the very energy-intensive process in which the minerals come out and then they're zapped with electricity. We even import bauxite for the single biggest consumer, that's South 32 in Richards Bay, where aluminium is produced from imports of the raw material. And that's the process that probably needs to be looked at when we have an energy crisis, is the payoff from using so much electricity and creating so much CO2 in the process. For example, the single largest point source in the world is where we squeeze our coal in Secunda. That small Dorpy is actually where there's so much from Sasol of CO2 going up even before the petrol is burned. And squeezing coal to make a few drops of petrol that we could import may be one of those questions. What about demand management? Are we using electricity properly? Because that sort of level of CO2 emissions from Secunda or from Richards Bay or any of the smelters, even if they were able to get green electricity going in, they're still massive emitters. And that in turn will create conditions by which we all suffer climate sanctions from Western trading partners. So it's exactly the right time to ask the mining industry. And I'd single out the energy intensive users group. It's 27 companies. They consume 40% of the electricity and only produce about 20% of output and less than 5% of jobs. This is the right time to be asking for those workers, can we get the just transition that's been promised? For the companies, are they really using this scarce electricity properly when so many greenhouse gas emissions result?
Prof, you've alluded to quantifying the loss and damages incurred to date, and perhaps how we're going to navigate that going forward. You've spoken about, how climate change has affected processes, and it's also going to affect industrial policy at large. I'm bringing this all up because I want to know how it's then ultimately also going to affect supply, demand, and implied pricing of commodities going forward. I mean, that's also going to impact how we trade and how we fit into the global sphere at the end of the day.
Yes, that's right, Liesl. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism from Europe and then the US, Canada, Japan, the Western polluters will be adopting tougher measures on their own companies. And then they'll try to stop cheating. In other words, where an importer from the US or Europe brings in something from South Africa with much higher carbon input, because our energy that goes into these export products still has too much coal, or might even move to gas. Methane gas is 85 times more potent in the next 20 years than CO2. So all this talk of offshore gas, or car power ships using gas, or gas imported from Cabo Delgado, Mozambique, where there's a big war raging, where our SANDF troops, I think that will be seen as an historic mistake because of the climate sanctions. And the dilemma, Liesl, is that the Treasury has set our carbon tax very low. In US dollars, it's 35 cents a ton for most of our emitting from the two big ones, Eskom and Sasol. And in comparison, Sweden is $132 a ton. The European Union emissions trading scheme, very chaotic casino, but they're at least at $100 a ton. That's more serious carbon pricing. And of course, South Africa does many things, unfortunately, in a tokenistic way. And trading partners won't like it that our polluters can get away with practically free emissions that are destroying the planet, and as you see, destroying our own citizenry, especially when we look at race and class. There's a terrible bias amongst those of us, myself included, who have high carbon footprints, and those of us in South Africa who are the victims. Of the 500 who died in Durban, no whites, no rich people, all poor working class black people, mainly women, many children. So I do think we need to be perhaps subject to some climate sanctions to bring down those high emissions, and then to find some way to compensate these victims like you've seen in Khumani.
Prof, yeah, you've said so much, and there's so much that I want to get into, but in the interest of time, I think I just want to look at roles and responsibilities. The cost of clean energy is not going to come free. We also have to start to look at the economic logic of towns and cities, perhaps how they were structured, the impact climate change is having on infrastructure, and how we ensure that these towns and cities don't run dry. So I'm asking this because the issue of municipalities also now need to come to the fore: governance, administration, and the role and responsibility going forward in terms of what needs to be executed. I know I've asked a lot, and I wonder how you could condense all of that just as we navigate the short-term effects leading into the long-term effects on a local government level, international.
Well, I think the one word is money, and that's because the finance minister, in fact, not just Enoch Godongwana, but his predecessor, Tito Mboweni, they've been engaged in austerity. They're cutting budgets, and municipalities have faced that. That's why we've seen municipalities going to court against Eskom for the mass disconnections, just disconnecting everyone because the city can't afford to pay. And I hope in 4 days at the budget speech, there's a little rationality, and that's reversed. And Finance Minister Godongwana realizes that more money will be needed by municipalities to invest in stormwater drainage and many of the other ways to strengthen public infrastructure, and to get more housing, better housing for people not in the floodplains. But the main dilemma is the power relations, and we still have an economy and a relationship to the world economy that's pressuring Enoch Godongwana to cut budgets. So unless we're seeing more protests that he realizes could lead to the end of his political party's rule in South Africa, more dissent, and also, as you say, more subsidization for poor people who would be affected because of the long distances that they travel from a township into the center of town. So we need some stronger subsidization of free basic electricity and transport. That would be what I would hope in 4 days might be the first of the contributions that a newly awakened government. However, I've been disappointed because in Durban, they'll tell you they didn't have the money because Enoch Godongwana kept very tight rein on it.
Prof, lots of questions, more questions than answers at this point. But thank you for starting the conversation. We'll have to leave it there for now and perhaps take it further as the days unfold. Professor Patrick Bond, Professor for Sociology at the University of Johannesburg.